Blood dripping from her lip, Zoe Franklin stood frozen as the entire cabin fell silent. The flight attendant who'd forcibly removed her from first class now stared at the platinum card. In his trembling hands, "You own 40% of Meridian Airlines," his voice cracked with terror. "Before I continue this shocking story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. If you've ever witnessed or experienced discrimination, hit that like button and subscribe to hear how Zoe turns this humiliating moment into a powerful transformation. The way she handles what happens next will leave you speechless." Zoe Franklin wasn't born into wealth or privilege. At 38, the brilliant entrepreneur had earned every penny of her considerable fortune through relentless determination and an innovative mind that revolutionized the tech industry. 3 years ago, she had sold her cybersecurity startup for a staggering $4 billion, a fact known to very few outside her intimate circle. Even fewer knew that she had quietly become the largest individual shareholder of Meridian Airlines, owning 40% of the troubled carrier after investing during their financial crisis. Growing up in South Chicago's roughest neighborhood, Zoe had watched her single mother, Elaine, work 3 jobs just to keep food on the table. Their tiny apartment, with its leaking roof and unreliable heating, had been a far cry from the penthouse she now owned in downtown Atlanta. But despite their financial struggles, Elaine had instilled in her daughter an unshakable sense of dignity and self-worth. "Never let anyone make you feel small," her mother would say, her tired eyes somehow still glimmering with pride. "Your mind is a gift. Use it to build the world you deserve." Today, Zoe had deliberately chosen to fly incognito. Her custom-tailored suits and designer accessories remained in her Seattle hotel room. Instead, she wore faded blue jeans, white sneakers, and a simple navy blouse. Her natural hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, her face bare of makeup except for a touch of lip gloss. The 20-carat diamond ring that usually adorned her finger had been replaced by a simple silver band, a keepsake from her mother. As she drove her rental car to Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, Zoe's mind drifted back to her childhood, to Mrs. Reynolds, her 6th-grade geography teacher, the only white teacher who seemed to truly see her potential. Mrs. Reynolds had sparked Zoe's fascination with the wider world. "You could go anywhere, Zoe," she'd said, pointing to the colorful world map that covered an entire classroom wall. "Your brilliance will open doors across continents." At 12, those words had seemed like fantasy to a girl who had never traveled further than the Chicago city limits. Now, having visited 63 countries and counting, Zoe smiled at the memory. She had established a scholarship in Mrs. Reynolds' name 5 years ago, sending promising students from her old neighborhood to study abroad. The past week had been brutally demanding. Zoe had flown to Seattle to personally oversee the acquisition of a promising new software company that would complement her investment portfolio. Days of tense negotiations had culminated in a successful deal, but the process had left her mentally and physically drained. All she wanted now was to relax in the comfort of first class on her flight back to Atlanta, perhaps enjoy a glass of champagne, and catch up on sleep before diving back into her hectic schedule. Pulling into the airport's short-term parking, Zoe grabbed her carry-on bag and made her way toward the terminal. As always when traveling commercially, she maintained a low profile, preferring to observe how the airline really treated its customers, rather than receiving special treatment as an owner. At the premium check-in counter, the attendant's eyes flickered over her casual attire, a flash of judgment crossing her face before her customer service training kicked in. "Economy check-in is down that way," she said, not even looking up from her computer. "I'm flying first class," Zoe replied calmly, sliding her ID and premium membership card across the counter. The woman looked up, surprise evident in her raised eyebrows. She took the cards, examining them with unnecessary scrutiny. "Is there a problem?" Zoe asked, keeping her voice level despite the familiar sting of prejudice. "No, no problem," the attendant replied, though her tone suggested otherwise. "It's just, we need to verify all premium tickets." Zoe nodded, having experienced this particular verification countless times before. Always the double checks, the second glances, the unspoken question, How did someone like you afford this? After receiving her boarding pass with obvious reluctance, Zoe made her way through security. The TSA agent pulled her aside for a random search. As often happened when she traveled in casual clothes, another black woman in line, dressed in business attire, caught Zoe's eye and offered a knowing look of solidarity. The first-class lounge should have been a sanctuary, but even there, Zoe couldn't escape the subtle indignities. The host at the entrance blocked her path. "Excuse me, ma'am, this is the first-class lounge," he said with exaggerated patience, as if speaking to someone who couldn't read the sign. Wordlessly, Zoe presented her boarding pass and membership card. His expression shifted minutely as he scanned them. "My apologies, Miss Franklin. Please enjoy your stay." Inside, Zoe found a quiet corner and opened her laptop, but she couldn't focus. Distracted by the glances from other passengers, a white couple whispered to each other, looking in her direction. A businessman in an expensive suit made a show of checking that his laptop was secure when she sat near him. These small indignities weren't new. Despite her wealth and accomplishments, Zoe was still seen first and foremost through the lens of her skin color. She had learned to navigate these waters, to pick her battles, to maintain her dignity in the face of ignorance. But sometimes, like today, the cumulative weight of these experiences left her bone-tired. When the announcement came for first-class boarding, Zoe gathered her belongings, squared her shoulders, and headed toward gate D23, unaware that this routine flight was about to become anything but ordinary. Gate D23 buzzed with the usual pre-boarding energy. Business travelers tapped impatiently on phones. Families corralled excited children, and gate agents prepared for the boarding process. Zoe approached the priority lane, boarding pass in hand. Bradley Thompson had worked as a flight attendant for Meridian Airlines for 20 years. At 52, his once blonde hair had faded to a distinguished silver, matching the wings pinned to his immaculately pressed uniform. His career had been built on providing impeccable service to Meridian's premium passengers who, in his experience, fit a very specific profile. When Bradley spotted Zoe in the first-class boarding lane, his mouth tightened almost imperceptibly. To him, she didn't fit the profile. In his 2 decades of service, he had developed certain expectations about who belonged in the front of the plane. "Boarding pass, please," he said, his tone professionally cool as Zoe approached the scanner. She handed him the document. Bradley's eyes narrowed as he verified the first-class designation. He scanned it slowly, glancing between the pass and Zoe with poorly disguised suspicion. "Is there something wrong?" Zoe asked, recognizing the familiar signs of someone who believed she didn't belong. No, Bradley replied, finally scanning her pass. "It's just, we've had issues with frequent flyer miles being used fraudulently for upgrades." The implication was clear, and Zoe felt a flash of anger that she quickly suppressed. "I purchased this ticket directly," she said simply. Bradley forced a thin smile. "Of course, enjoy your flight." As Zoe walked down the jet bridge, she overheard Bradley murmuring to another flight attendant, Diana Ross, a slim woman in her 40s with blonde hair pulled into a tight bun. "Another one trying to play the system," he whispered. "Not quite. Quietly enough. Probably used points from a corporate account." Diana glanced at Zoe's retreating figure and nodded in agreement. They never even checked the names anymore. Inside the aircraft, a third flight attendant directed passengers to their seats. When Zoe showed her boarding pass indicating seat 2A, the young woman's eyes widened slightly, but she quickly recovered. "Right this way, ma'am." The first-class cabin of the Boeing 787 was configured with 16 spacious seats, arranged in a 1-to-1 configuration that offered each passenger direct aisle access. Zoe stored her carry-on in the overhead compartment and settled into her window seat, conscious of the stares from other passengers already seated. Across the aisle sat 2 white men in expensive suits, both giving her curious glances over their complimentary champagne. In the center section, a family with 2 well-behaved children were already engrossed in their tablets, the parents pointedly not looking in her direction. Zoe took a deep breath and closed her eyes briefly. She had earned this seat just like everyone else, more so. given her ownership stake in the airline. But she had learned long ago that certain people would always question her right to occupy certain spaces. As the remaining first-class passengers boarded, an elderly white woman with perfectly coiffed silver hair and a pearl necklace approached the seat next to Zoe. Evelyn Parker, aged 76, had been flying first class on Meridian for over 30 years, ever since her late husband's insurance business had taken off. Evelyn stopped in the aisle, her expression souring as she looked at Zoe. She beckoned Bradley, who was checking another passenger's seating arrangement. "Excuse me," she stage whispered, loud enough for Zoe and several nearby passengers to hear. "There seems to be a mistake with my seating assignment." Bradley hurried over. "What seems to be the problem, Mrs. Parker?" "I specifically requested a seat next to a window, not next to—" She glanced meaningfully at Zoe, leaving the sentence unfinished. Zoe kept her expression neutral, though her fingers tightened around the armrest. She had experienced this before, the discomfort of white passengers at finding themselves seated next to a black person, especially in premium cabins. "Let me see what I can do," Bradley said, immediately solicitous. Without even acknowledging Zoe, he checked his tablet. "We do have another window seat available in row 4. Would that be acceptable?" "That would be much better, thank you," Evelyn replied with obvious relief. As Bradley escorted Evelyn to her new seat, Zoe noticed several passengers exchanging glances. Some looked uncomfortable, others indifferent. A few seemed to share Evelyn's sentiment. None spoke up. A few minutes later, Bradley returned to Zoe's row. "May I see your boarding pass again, please? You already scanned it at the gate." Zoe replied evenly. "Yes, but we need to verify all seating assignments. There might have been a mistake." Zoe reached into her purse and produced the boarding pass again. Bradley examined it with exaggerated care, as if searching for evidence of forgery. "This does say to A," he conceded reluctantly, "but I'm not sure if— Is there a problem with my ticket?" Zoe interrupted, keeping her voice steady despite the simmering frustration. Bradley's professional mask slipped for just a moment, revealing a flash of disdain. "No, not at all. I'll be right back." As he walked away, Zoe felt the familiar internal struggle. Should she speak up more forcefully about this treatment, or stay calm to avoid being labeled as difficult or aggressive? Labels that seemed all too readily applied to black women who stood their ground. The calculation was one she had made countless times before: weigh the indignity of silence against the potential consequences of self-advocacy in boardrooms and business deals. She had learned to pick her moments carefully, but as an anonymous passenger, the power dynamic shifted considerably. Little did Bradley know, the woman he was so casually disrespecting could buy and sell this airline several times over. The irony wasn't lost on Zoe as she watched him confer with Diana at the front of the cabin, both of them glancing in her direction with poorly concealed suspicion. The confrontation was just beginning, but Zoe Franklin had faced down prejudice her entire life. What she couldn't know was how dramatically this particular incident would escalate, or how it would ultimately transform not just her day, but the culture of an entire corporation. The main cabin had begun to fill with economy passengers, the narrow aisles crowded with travelers struggling to find overhead bin space for their luggage. Through the partition curtain, Zoe could see the stark contrast between the spacious first-class section and the cramped economy seats. It was a division she had experienced from both sides, having spent her college years saving for months just to afford the cheapest economy ticket home for Christmas. Bradley returned with Diana and a third flight attendant, a younger man named Tyler Jenkins. Their approach had the deliberate coordination of people who believed they were about to handle a situation. "Ms. Franklin," Bradley began, his voice carrying just enough authority to attract the attention of nearby passengers. "We seem to have an issue with your seating assignment." Zoe looked up from her phone. "I don't see how that's possible. My boarding pass clearly indicates seat to A, which is the seat." Diana stepped forward. "Sometimes our system makes errors with upgrades and premium bookings. We'll need to reseat you while we sort this out." The practiced ease with which they delivered this lie made Zoe wonder how many other black passengers had been subjected to similar treatment, downgraded based on nothing but their appearance and the crew's assumptions. What specific error are you referring to? Zoe asked, her voice calm but firm. My ticket was purchased months ago, not upgraded, and your gate agent verified it before I boarded. Bradley and Diana exchanged glances, clearly not expecting this level of resistance. Well, Bradley said, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper that nonetheless carried to nearby seats. We've had issues with fraudulent bookings recently. People using stolen credit cards or manipulating the frequent flyer system. The implication hung in the air, ugly and unmistakable. Several nearby passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others pretended to be absorbed in their devices. Just then, a commotion at the front of the cabin drew everyone's attention. A white man in his 40s, wearing a rumpled business suit and carrying a briefcase, rushed onto the plane. So sorry I'm late, he called out cheerfully. Traffic was a nightmare. Tyler, who had been standing silently behind Bradley and Diana, immediately moved to assist the latecomer. Mr. Harrington, welcome aboard. Let me help you with that bag. Without checking his boarding pass or questioning his right to be there, Tyler guided the man to an empty first-class seat across the aisle from Zoe. Can I get you a pre-departure beverage, sir? Champagne, perhaps? The contrast was so stark that Zoe couldn't help but shake her head slightly. She reached for her phone and began recording, positioning it discreetly on her lap. I'm still waiting to understand the specific issue with my seat, she said, redirecting the flight attendants. Attention, could you please explain exactly what the problem is? Bradley's expression hardened. The problem, ma'am, is that this seat is reserved for our premium passengers. I am a premium passenger, Zoe replied, her patience wearing thin. Your boarding pass may say first class, but there's clearly been a mistake, Diana interjected, her tone suggesting she was speaking to someone of limited intelligence. This type of seating is typically reserved for our executive travelers. What type of travelers do you think I am? The question hung unspoken in the air. Instead, Zoe calmly held up her boarding pass again. This is a valid first-class ticket for this flight. Unless you can show me some specific error, I'm not moving from my assigned seat. Bradley's face flushed with anger. Listen, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. There are plenty of economy seats available where you'd be more comfortable. The mask had slipped completely now, the pretense of a system error abandoned in favor of naked prejudice around them. The tension in the cabin was palpable. Some passengers were now openly watching the confrontation, a few surreptitiously recording with their phones, others stared fixedly ahead, the bystander effect in full force. Do you think Zoe should continue standing her ground, or would it be safer for her to temporarily comply? Comment number 1 if you believe she should refuse to move, or number 2 if you think she should find another way to address the discrimination. Don't forget to like and subscribe to find out what happens next in this shocking true story. Would you have the courage to challenge such blatant prejudice if you were in her position? Zoe took a deep breath, centering herself. I'd like to speak with the captain. Diana laughed, a short, dismissive sound. That won't be necessary. The captain is preparing for departure and doesn't need to be bothered with seating issues. This isn't a seating issue, Zoe replied. This is discrimination. And I believe your captain would want to know that his crew is illegally removing a passenger from her rightfully purchased seat based solely on her appearance. The word discrimination caused an immediate reaction. A couple of passengers murmured to each other, and even Tyler looked uncomfortable. That's a serious accusation, Bradley said, his voice low and threatening. One that could cause you a lot of problems. I'm well aware of how serious it is, Zoe replied, which is why I've been recording this interaction. She tilted her phone slightly to make the active recording visible. Bradley's expression darkened further. Recording is against airline policy. Actually, it isn't, Zoe countered. I've reviewed Meridian's policies thoroughly, and there's no prohibition against passengers recording their own interactions with staff. There is, however, a very clear anti-discrimination policy that you're currently violating. Diana, sensing they were losing control of the situation, tried a different approach. Look, we're not discriminating against anyone. We're simply trying to ensure that all our passengers are in their correct seats before takeoff. Then why didn't you check Mr. Harrington's boarding pass when he boarded late? Zoe asked, gesturing toward the white businessman who was now happily sipping champagne. Why am I the only passenger being asked to verify my seat assignment multiple times? The question hung in the air, unanswerable without admitting the truth. Bradley leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. I've been flying this route for 20 years, and I know our regular customers. You're creating a disturbance, and if you don't move to economy right now, we'll have no choice but to remove you from the flight entirely. Zoe met his gaze steadily. I am not creating a disturbance. I am sitting quietly in the seat I purchased. You are the one causing a scene by attempting to illegally remove me from my assigned seat. Diana signaled to Tyler, who had been hovering uncertainly nearby. Go get Jason, she murmured, referring to the head flight attendant who was currently helping passengers in economy. Moments later, Tyler returned with Jason Morris, a tall white woman in her 50s with short gray hair and the confident bearing of someone used to being in charge. What seems to be the problem here? Jason asked, taking in the situation with a practiced eye. Before Zoe could speak, Bradley jumped in. This passenger is refusing to comply with crew instructions and is disrupting the boarding process. She's been asked multiple times to move to her correct seating area. Jason turned to Zoe with a stern expression. Ma'am, federal regulations require all passengers to comply with crew member instructions. Failure to do so is a federal offense. I'm aware of the regulations, Zoe replied calmly. However, those regulations don't permit discriminatory treatment. I have a valid first-class ticket for this seat, which has been verified multiple times. Your crew is attempting to remove me without cause. Jason glanced at the boarding pass Zoe held out, then at Bradley and Diana. Something in their expressions must have given her pause, because her approach softened slightly. Let me see if I can sort this out, she said, taking the boarding pass and examining it. After a moment, she looked up. This does appear to be a valid first-class ticket. Of course it is, Zoe said, as I've been saying all along. Jason handed the boarding pass back, but still seemed reluctant to directly contradict her colleagues. Nevertheless, if the crew is determined there's an issue, we need to resolve it before takeoff. Perhaps you could move to economy just for now, and we can sort this out once we're airborne. No, Zoe said firmly. I will not accept being downgraded because of how I look. This is textbook discrimination, and I will not participate in normalizing it by complying. The standoff had reached a critical point. The boarding process was nearly complete, with only a few stragglers still finding their seats in economy. The flight was scheduled to depart in 15 minutes, and the mounting tension in first class threatened to delay takeoff. Jason made a decision. Miss Franklin, I'm going to have to insist. Either move to economy for now, or we'll be forced to remove you from the flight entirely. It was the same false choice that had been presented to countless black passengers before her. Submit to discrimination or face even more severe consequences. The system was designed to make resistance as costly as possible. But Zoe Franklin was not a woman who backed down in the face of injustice, not anymore. Not after everything she had achieved. Not after promising her mother that she would always stand in her truth. I will not move, she said, her voice clear and resolute. And if you attempt to remove me from this flight without cause, I will ensure that everyone involved is held accountable to the fullest extent of the law. The gauntlet had been thrown down. What happened next would change the course of not just this flight, but of Meridian Airlines itself. The tension in the first-class cabin had reached a breaking point. Jason nodded almost imperceptibly to Bradley and Tyler, a silent command that sent a chill through Zoe. She had seen this choreography before, the moment when authority figures decided that physical force was their next option. Final warning, Bradley said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. Either move to economy voluntarily, or we'll be forced to remove you. Zoe remained seated, her posture upright and dignified. I will not be moving from my rightfully purchased seat. Any attempt to forcibly remove me will constitute assault and battery, in addition to the civil rights violations already in progress. Her calm legal analysis only seemed to further enrage Bradley, whose face had turned an alarming shade of red. In his 20 years of service, he had rarely been challenged so directly, especially by someone he had already decided didn't belong. "We tried to be reasonable," he snapped, nodding to Tyler. What happened next occurred with shocking speed. Bradley grabbed Zoe's left arm while Tyler took her right, with practiced coordination that suggested this wasn't their first time removing a passenger. They yanked her upward from her seat. "Take your hands off me," Zoe demanded, her voice rising for the first time. "You have no right to touch me." The sudden physical contact triggered a cascade of memories. The time in 7th grade, when a teacher had dragged her from class for talking back, when she'd simply corrected a historical inaccuracy, the security guard who had followed her through an upscale store, then roughly detained her at the exit despite her having a receipt, the police officer who had slammed her against a car during a routine traffic stop her 2nd year of law school. Throughout her life, Zoe had learned that her black body was seen as inherently threatening, inherently suspect, inherently available for control by those with authority. Even now, with all her wealth and accomplishments, that fundamental reality hadn't changed. "Stop resisting," Bradley hissed, tightening his grip. "I'm not resisting," Zoe replied, wincing at the pressure on her arm. "I'm asking you to stop assaulting me." Round them, the first-class cabin had fallen into stunned silence. The businessman who had been seated across from Zoe was filming with his phone, his earlier indifference replaced by shock. Evelyn Parker, who had refused to sit next to Zoe earlier, now watched with a hand pressed to her mouth. Bradley and Tyler continued pulling Zoe from her seat, their grips painful enough to leave bruises. As they dragged her into the aisle, her foot caught on the seat structure, causing her to lurch forward. Bradley, unprepared for the shift in weight, lost his balance, sending Zoe crashing face first into the seat in front of her. Pain exploded across her lower face as her lip caught on the metal seat track. The metallic taste of blood filled her mouth, and she felt warm liquid dripping down her chin. "Oh my God, you're hurting her," a voice called out from several rows back. Zoe turned to see a young Asian woman standing in the aisle, her expression horrified. Melissa Chen, a 29-year-old environmental lawyer, had been watching the situation unfold with increasing distress. "This is completely unacceptable," Melissa continued, her voice shaking with anger. "You can't just assault a passenger like this. Stay out of this." Diana warned her, "This doesn't concern you. It concerns all of us when you're violently removing a passenger who hasn't done anything wrong." Melissa countered. Bradley, momentarily distracted by this new challenge to his authority, loosened his grip on Zoe's arm. She took the opportunity to pull free, pressing a hand to her bleeding lip. "I want all of your names and employee ID numbers," she said, blood staining her fingers. "And I want them now." Jason stepped forward, finally seeming to realize that the situation had spiraled dangerously out of control. "Everyone needs to calm down, Zoe repeated incredulously. "Your staff just physically assaulted me, causing bodily harm in front of dozens of witnesses." Calming down is not an appropriate response. As Zoe stood there, blood dripping from her split lip, her mind raced through a lifetime of similar moments, times when she had been expected to accept mistreatment graciously, to prioritize the comfort of others over her own dignity, to calm down in the face of injustice. She thought of her mother, who had worked as a housekeeper for wealthy white families, swallowing daily indignities to keep food on their table. She thought of her college roommate, who had been arrested for trespassing while studying in their own university library after hours. She thought of her former business partner, who had been repeatedly mistaken for the janitorial staff in the very tech company he had co-founded. The cumulative weight of these experiences settled in her chest, alongside a new resolve. This would not stand. Not today, not anymore. With a steady hand, despite the adrenaline coursing through her system, Zoe reached for her phone and took a photo of each flight attendant's name badge. Tyler looked away, shame finally registering on his young face. Diana maintained her cold stare while Bradley continued to fume. "This will cost you your job," he threatened, his voice low enough that only Zoe could hear. A bitter laugh escaped her. If only he knew. Jason, sensing that the situation had become a significant liability for the airline, tried to de-escalate it. "Miss Franklin, let's get you some medical attention for that lip, and then we can discuss a solution that works for everyone. The only acceptable solution is for me to return to my assigned seat, receive proper medical attention, and for these 3 employees to be removed from this flight," Zoe replied, her voice carrying clearly through the cabin. Jason shook her head. "That's not going to be possible. The best I can offer is a seat in Economy Plus and a voucher for a future flight." It was the classic corporate response, attempt to buy off the victim of discrimination. With minimal concessions, avoid acknowledging the real issue, and hope the problem goes away quietly. In the past, Zoe might have accepted the offer, might have calculated that the personal cost of further confrontation outweighed the principle at stake. But standing there in the aisle, blood on her shirt and the eyes of dozens of passengers on her, something crystallized in her mind. She had spent years building her fortune in part so that she would never again have to tolerate such treatment. She had worked 80-hour weeks, sacrificed personal relationships, and pushed herself to the breaking point to create financial independence that would serve as armor against the world's prejudices. And now she owned 40% of this very airline. For 3 years, she had remained an anonymous investor, observing from a distance how the company operated. She had attended board meetings via proxy, reviewed quarterly reports with a keen eye, and planned a gradual transformation of the corporate culture. But perhaps gradual change wasn't what Meridian Airlines needed. Perhaps what it needed was a seismic shock. With perfect clarity, Zoe made her decision. She reached into her purse and removed a small leather wallet, different from the one she had used to store her ID and credit cards. This one was thinner, more elegant, containing only a single platinum card with the Meridian Airlines logo embossed in one corner. "Before this goes any further," she said, her voice suddenly infused with the quiet authority that had made her a formidable presence in boardrooms across the country, "I think there's something you should know." She extended the card toward Bradley, whose expression shifted from anger to confusion. "What's this supposed to be?" he asked suspiciously. "Take it," Zoe said simply. Bradley snatched the card from her hand, clearly expecting some form of frequent flyer identification or perhaps a business card with an attorney's information. As he read what was printed on its surface, the blood drained from his face. The cabin fell completely silent as his expression transformed from contempt to horror. Blood dripping from her lip, Zoe Franklin stood frozen as the entire cabin fell silent. The flight attendant who'd forcibly removed her from first class now stared at the platinum card. In his trembling hands, "You own 40% of Meridian Airlines," his voice cracked with terror. Bradley's complexion had gone from angry red to ashen gray in seconds. The platinum ownership identification card shook visibly between his fingers as the implications crashed over him like a tidal wave. The woman he had just physically assaulted, the passenger he had tried to humiliate and remove, was not just any customer. She was the single largest individual shareholder of the entire airline. This can't be right," he stammered, looking from the card to Zoe and back again. Diana pushed forward to see the card, her practiced composure cracking as she read its contents. "Oh my God," she whispered. Jason, the head flight attendant, reached for the card with a trembling hand. "Miss Franklin, we had no idea." "Clearly," Zoe replied, pressing a cocktail napkin to her bleeding lip. "And that's precisely the problem, isn't it? Because you shouldn't need to know that I own part of this airline to treat me with basic human dignity." The cabin remained eerily silent. Every passenger was now fully engaged in the drama unfolding before them, many recording with their phones. This was no longer just an incident of discrimination, it was a moment of extraordinary reversal. The kind of story that would spread across social media within hours. "We need to get the captain," Jason said, her authoritative demeanor completely abandoned. "Yes," Zoe agreed. "I think that would be appropriate." As Jason rushed toward the cockpit, Zoe returned to her seat into the very seat from which she had been forcibly removed minutes earlier. No one tried to stop her this time. Bradley and Diana stood frozen in the aisle. The hierarchical certainty that had governed their actions now shattered beyond repair. Zoe's mind flashed back to 3 years earlier, to the boardroom of her investment firm in downtown Atlanta. The CEO of Meridian Airlines, Richard Coleman, had come hat in hand, seeking capital to keep the struggling carrier afloat. During a particularly difficult financial quarter, we've had to cut routes, reduce staff, even consider selling off aircraft, he had explained. His presentation slides showing declining revenue and increasing operational costs. But I believe in this airline. With the right investment and leadership, we can turn things around. Zoe had studied the numbers carefully. Meridian wasn't a lost cause. It had a solid route network, a decent fleet, and strong brand recognition. What it lacked was innovative leadership and a coherent long-term strategy. What would you do with a significant capital injection? She had asked, watching Coleman's face carefully. Modernize our fleet, expand into underserved markets, improve our customer experience, he had replied, his enthusiasm genuine. Meridian has good bones. We just need the resources to realize our potential. After weeks of due diligence, Zoe had made her decision. Through a complex series of financial maneuvers designed to maintain her anonymity, she had purchased 40% of Meridian's stock, becoming the airline's largest individual shareholder. The remaining 60% was divided among various institutional investors and smaller stakeholders. Her investment had come with conditions. While she would remain a silent partner initially, she would have significant input on major strategic decisions through her proxy on the board, and she would be conducting her own assessment of the company's operations, including regularly flying as a normal passenger to experience the service firsthand. I want to see how Meridian treats its customers when they don't know they're being watched, she had told her financial advisor. The true character of a company is revealed in those moments. For 3 years, she had flown Meridian dozens of times, in both economy and first class, collecting data points on everything from boarding procedures to in-flight service to baggage handling. She had noticed patterns, the consistent microaggressions directed at passengers of color, the disparity in how complaints were addressed, the subtle ways certain customers were made to feel unwelcome in premium spaces. She had planned to bring these observations to the board gradually, to push for systematic changes without creating defensiveness or backlash. But now, with her blood literally staining her shirt collar, that measured approach no longer seemed adequate. The cockpit door opened, and Captain David Reynolds emerged, his expression a mixture of confusion and concern. A 25-year veteran of the airline, Reynolds had the steady demeanor of someone used to handling crises at 37,000 feet. "Ms. Franklin?" he asked, approaching her seat. "I understand there's been a situation. That's putting it mildly, Captain," Zoe replied, still holding the napkin to her lip. "Your crew physically assaulted me while attempting to remove me from my rightfully purchased seat, resulting in this injury." She gestured to her bleeding lip. Captain Reynolds looked genuinely appalled. "I had no idea the situation had escalated to physical contact. This is completely unacceptable." He turned to Jason. "Is this accurate?" Jason, to her credit, didn't attempt to minimize what had happened. "Yes, sir. There was a misunderstanding about Ms. Franklin's seating assignment. That escalated inappropriately." "A misunderstanding?" Zoe echoed. "Let's be clear about what happened. Your crew saw a black woman in first class and immediately assumed I didn't belong here. Despite my valid boarding pass, I was questioned repeatedly, threatened, and ultimately physically assaulted, all based on nothing but racist assumptions." Several passengers nodded in agreement, while others looked uncomfortable at the explicit naming of racism. "And then," Zoe continued, "I was forced to reveal my identity as a major shareholder of this airline, just to be treated with basic human dignity. Ask yourself, Captain, how many other passengers have been subjected to similar treatment but lack the power to fight back?" Captain Reynolds appeared genuinely disturbed. "Ms. Franklin, on behalf of Meridian Airlines, I want to offer my sincere apologies for this inexcusable treatment. I assure you that this does not reflect our values as an organization." "With respect, Captain, it absolutely does reflect your values," Zoe countered. "Not the values you print in your employee handbook or advertise in your marketing materials, but the actual operational values demonstrated by your staff's behavior. What happened today wasn't an anomaly, it was the logical outcome of a corporate culture that tolerates bias and discrimination. The captain seemed at a loss for words, clearly unprepared for such a direct challenge to the company's fundamental character. "What would you like us to do at this point, Miss Franklin?" he finally asked. "First, I want immediate medical attention for my injury," Zoe replied. "Second, I want these 3 flight attendants removed from duty on this flight. They've demonstrated that they cannot be trusted to treat all passengers equally and professionally." Captain Reynolds nodded. "We have a first aid kit that won't be necessary," Zoe interrupted. "I'm sure there's a doctor on board who can provide proper care." She raised her voice slightly. "Is there a medical professional on this flight?" A middle-aged woman a few rows back raised her hand. "I'm a physician," she said, already reaching for her carry-on bag where she kept a compact medical kit. "Thank you," Zoe said, then turned back to the captain. "As for the crew members involved, I want them off this flight immediately." Captain Reynolds hesitated only briefly before nodding. "Bradley, Diana, Tyler, please gather your personal items and exit the aircraft. Report to crew management upon arrival at the terminal." The 3 flight attendants stood frozen, clearly struggling to process how quickly their situation had deteriorated. "Now," the captain added firmly as they moved to comply. Bradley couldn't resist one final comment. "This isn't fair," he muttered. As he passed Zoe's seat, "We were just following protocol." "Were you following protocol when you suggested I'd committed credit card fraud?" Zoe asked quietly. "Or when you physically grabbed me hard enough to leave bruises? Tell me, is that written down somewhere in the Meridian Employee Handbook?" Bradley had no response. With a final glare, he followed Diana and Tyler toward the exit. The news of what was happening spread quickly throughout the cabin. Passengers in economy craned their necks to see what was causing the delay, while those in first class whispered among themselves, occasionally casting glances at Zoe as the doctor examined her injured lip. "You'll need a few stitches," the physician informed her after cleaning the wound. "I can apply a butterfly bandage for now, but you should see a proper emergency room after we land." "Thank you, doctor," Zoe said, wincing slightly as the woman applied the temporary closure. Captain Reynolds had returned to the cockpit to arrange for replacement flight attendants, delaying departure by at least 30 minutes. The remaining crew members moved through the cabin with nervous efficiency, avoiding eye contact with Zoe and offering profuse apologies to the other passengers for the delay. Evelyn Parker, who had earlier refused to sit next to Zoe, now approached her seat with visible discomfort. I want to apologize," she said, her voice quavering slightly. "My behavior was inexcusable." Zoe regarded her thoughtfully. "Yes, it was," she agreed. "But at least you're acknowledging it. That's a start." Evelyn nodded, clearly unsure what else to say. After an awkward moment, she returned to her seat in row 4. Meanwhile, Zoe's phone had begun buzzing incessantly with notifications. Despite the airplane mode setting, text messages from her executive assistant were breaking through an emergency override feature she had installed for crisis situations. Viral videos of incident on Meridian flight circulating online. Read. The first message, "PR team assembling. Need instructions." Zoe wasn't surprised. In today's hyper-connected world, incidents like this spread at the speed of light. Multiple passengers had been filming, and at least some of those videos were already making their way across social media platforms. For a moment, she considered how to respond. Her natural inclination toward privacy argued for containment, for handling this quietly behind closed doors. But another part of her, the part that remembered every slight, every indignity, every moment when she'd been made to feel less than, recognized the power of public accountability. "No statement yet," she texted back. "I'll handle personally after landing." This incident wouldn't be swept under the rug with confidential settlements and non-disclosure agreements. This would be a moment of reckoning, not just for Bradley, Diana, and Tyler, but for Meridian Airlines as an institution, and perhaps for the airline industry as a whole. As replacement flight attendants boarded the aircraft and prepared for a delayed departure, Zoe sat quietly in her first-class seat, the butterfly bandage on her lip a visceral reminder of what had transpired. The cabin around her had transformed. Where earlier she had been treated as an unwelcome intruder, now she was regarded with a mixture of awe, sympathy, and from some, a newfound respect. But Zoe took no satisfaction in this reversal. The respect she was now receiving wasn't based on her humanity, but on her power, the very thing that shouldn't be necessary to secure equal treatment. In the first place, the true test would come in the days and weeks ahead, as she leveraged her position to ensure that what had happened to her never happened to another Meridian passenger again, regardless of whether they owned 40% of the company or were flying on a once-in-a-lifetime budget ticket. As the aircraft finally pushed back from the gate, nearly an hour behind schedule, Zoe Franklin began formulating a plan that would transform Meridian Airlines from the inside out. The Boeing 787 reached its cruising altitude of 35,000 feet. The seatbelt sign dinged off, and an uncomfortable silence permeated the first-class cabin. The replacement flight attendants moved with exaggerated courtesy, their smiles too bright, their offers of service too frequent, especially to Zoe, whose presence now radiated an almost tangible authority. "Miss Franklin, would you like another ice pack for your lip?" asked Amelia, the senior replacement flight attendant who had been hastily called in after Bradley, Diana, and Tyler were removed from the flight. "No, thank you," Zoe replied. "The doctor's butterfly bandage is sufficient for now. Perhaps some champagne? Or we have an excellent selection of premium wines. Just water, please." Amelia nodded, clearly desperate to provide some form of exceptional service that might offset the catastrophic treatment Zoe had received earlier. "Right away, and please, if there's anything else you need, anything at all, don't hesitate to ask." As Amelia hurried away, Zoe returned her attention to her tablet, where she was reviewing Meridian Airlines employee training materials documents she had access to as a major shareholder, but had never scrutinized in detail before. What she found was troubling, but not surprising. A few generic paragraphs about respecting diversity buried within hundreds of pages focused on procedural matters, with no substantive guidance on recognizing or addressing bias. The special treatment continued. Throughout the cabin, passengers who had sat silently during her harassment now found themselves on the receiving end of premium service, as well as if the crew hoped that by satisfying everyone else, they might somehow dilute the gravity of what had occurred. Melissa Chen, the young environmental lawyer who had spoken up during Zoe's removal, made her way forward from her Economy Plus seat when the seatbelt sign turned off. "Excuse me," she said, pausing beside Zoe's row. "I just wanted to check if you're okay." Zoe looked up from her tablet and offered a small smile, wincing slightly as the movement pulled at her injured lip, as well as can be expected given the circumstances. "Thank you for speaking up earlier. Not many people would have done that." Melissa shook her head. "Not enough people, you mean? I've seen that kind of treatment too many times, usually directed at my parents or grandparents." She hesitated, then added, "I'm sorry it took something so extreme for others to finally acknowledge what was happening." "I appreciate your concern," Zoe said sincerely. "What's your name?" "Melissa Chen. I'm an environmental attorney based in Atlanta." "Zoe Franklin. It's good to meet you, Melissa. Though I wish it had been under better circumstances." They exchanged a look of understanding that transcended their brief acquaintance, the unspoken recognition between two women of color who had navigated predominantly white spaces their entire lives. "If you don't mind my asking," Melissa said, lowering her voice, "do you really own part of Meridian Airlines?" Zoe nodded. 40%. "I've been a silent investor for the past 3 years." "That's wow." Melissa appeared genuinely impressed. "So what happens now?" It was a question Zoe had been asking herself since the moment she'd revealed her identity. What exactly did happen now? How would she transform this painful personal experience into meaningful institutional change? "Now," Zoe replied thoughtfully, "we make sure this incident isn't dismissed as the actions of a few bad apples. What happened today was a symptom of a systemic problem, and it will require a systemic solution." Melissa nodded in agreement. "If there's any way I can help professionally or otherwise, please let me know." She handed Zoe a business card. "My firm has done some work in corporate accountability that might be relevant." "Thank you. I'll keep that in mind." As Melissa returned to her seat, Zoe noticed Evelyn Parker watching their interaction from across the aisle. The elderly woman who had refused to sit next to her earlier now seemed eager to establish some form of connection. "That was quite something," Evelyn said, moving into the empty seat beside Zoe without asking permission. "I've never seen anything like it in all my years of flying." Zoe regarded her with a neutral expression. Which part? The discrimination or the consequences? Evelyn had the grace to look embarrassed. "Both, I suppose." She fidgeted with her pearl necklace. "I want you to know that I didn't ask to be moved because of, well, because of what you might think." "And what might I think, Mrs. Parker?" "That it was because of your..." Evelyn gestured vaguely, unwilling to explicitly mention race. "But it wasn't that at all. I just prefer window seats. For the view, you know." The explanation was so transparently false that Zoe might have laughed if her lip hadn't been throbbing. The seat Evelyn had been assigned was to be an aisle seat in Zoe's row. The seat she had requested to move to was for be another aisle seat, not a window. "Is that so?" Zoe said mildly. Evelyn nodded too enthusiastically. "Absolutely. I've always loved looking out at the clouds. My late husband, Herbert, he was in insurance. Very successful. He always booked us window seats when we traveled." How considerate of him. Sensing that her attempted rehabilitation wasn't going well, Evelyn shifted tactics. "My grandson has a friend who's black. Wonderful boy. Plays basketball with Tommy every Saturday." "How fascinating," Zoe replied dryly. "What I'm trying to say," Evelyn continued, increasingly flustered, "is that I'm not, you know, prejudiced." Zoe studied the older woman thoughtfully. There was something almost pitiful about her desperate attempt to rewrite her role in the day's events, to convince herself as much as Zoe that she wasn't part of the problem. "Mrs. Parker," Zoe said finally, "I think we both know exactly why you asked to be moved from the seat next to mine. The question is, do you have the courage to acknowledge it, even to yourself? What would you do if you were in Zoe's position? Comment number 1, if you would pursue legal action against the airline. Or number 2, if you would focus on creating systemic change from within as a major shareholder. Don't forget to like and subscribe to see how Zoe transforms this humiliating experience into powerful change. How would you handle someone like Evelyn who refuses to acknowledge their own prejudice? Evelyn's face flushed, her mouth opening and closing without sound. For a moment, it seemed she might actually engage in honest self-reflection. But then the practiced social mask slipped back into place. "Well, I never," she huffed, rising from the seat. "I was just trying to be friendly." As Evelyn retreated to her own row, Zoe couldn't help but reflect on how her response exemplified a broader pattern. When confronted with their own biases, many people responded with defensiveness rather than introspection, more concerned with maintaining their self-image as not racist than with examining the actual impact of their actions. Meanwhile, the news of what had happened continued to spread throughout the aircraft. Passengers from economy occasionally walked past the first-class cabin on their way to the lavatory, slowing deliberately to catch a glimpse of the woman who owned nearly half the airline and had been assaulted by its crew. Captain Reynolds emerged from the cockpit mid-flight to check on Zoe personally. "Miss Franklin, how are you feeling?" he asked, crouching beside her seat to speak quietly, physically. "I'll recover," she replied, "but I'm deeply concerned about what this incident reveals about Meridian's culture." The captain nodded gravely. "I want you to know that many of us are equally concerned. What happened today doesn't represent the values that drew me to this airline 25 years ago." "Then help me change it," Zoe said simply. "When we land, there will be pressure to minimize this incident, to treat it as an isolated case, rather than addressing the underlying issues. I'll need allies within the company who understand the need for real transformation." Captain Reynolds considered her words carefully. "I've seen patterns over the years, nothing as egregious as what happened today, but subtle things, different treatment based on who's sitting in which seat." He hesitated, then added, "I've tried to address it when I could, but you're one person in a system that doesn't prioritize these concerns." Zoe finished for him. "Yes," he admitted, "exactly that. Would you be willing to document your observations, to speak up during the investigation that will follow?" The captain didn't answer immediately. clearly weighing the professional risks against his conscience. Finally, he nodded. "Yes, I would. It's long overdue. Thank you, Captain Reynolds. That means more than you know." As he returned to the cockpit, Zoe's phone buzzed again with more urgent messages from her team. The videos had gone viral, with millions of views across multiple platforms. Hashtag Meridian Airlines and hashtag Zoe Franklin were trending nationally. News outlets were reaching out for statements. The company's stock price had already dropped 3% in late trading. PR crisis team assembled. Her chief of staff texted, "Board chair requesting emergency call before you land." Zoe typed a quick response, "No calls until I'm on the ground." Preparing comprehensive response strategy, she then opened her notes app and began outlining a plan that would address not just this incident, but the cultural and structural issues that had enabled it. By the time the aircraft began its descent into Atlanta, she had drafted a detailed framework for transformation that went far beyond the typical corporate damage control. This wouldn't be resolved with a hasty apology and a settlement check. Zoe Franklin had spent her career building systems and solving complex problems. Now she would apply those same skills to dismantling the structures of bias within Meridian Airlines, starting with the people responsible for today's incident, but not ending there, not by a long shot. As the plane touched down at Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport, Zoe looked out at the Atlanta skyline, the city where she had built her business empire, the city that had embraced her ambition even as it reminded her daily of the complex legacy of race in America. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Atlanta," came the announcement over the PA system. "Local time is 4:45 p.m. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened until we reach the gate and the captain turns off the fastened seatbelt sign." The usual instructions continued, but Zoe was already preparing for what awaited her beyond the aircraft door. This landing marked not the end of a journey, but the beginning of a much more significant one, a journey that would challenge an entire industry to confront its biases and emerge transformed. The aircraft door opened to reveal a scene unlike anything Zoe had ever experienced. The jet bridge was lined with airport security personnel, airline representatives in crisp uniforms, and most surprisingly, a phalanx of news cameras that flashed incessantly the moment she appeared in the doorway. "Ms. Franklin, can you comment on the incident aboard Flight 1527? Is it true you own 40% of Meridian Airlines? Will you be pressing charges against the flight attendants?" The barrage of questions hit her like a physical force. Zoe had anticipated media interest, but not this level of immediate coverage. Somehow, despite the flight's isolation from ground communications, the story had exploded across news outlets and social media platforms. Captain Reynolds appeared at her side. "We can escort you through a private exit if you prefer." "Miss Franklin," she considered the offer briefly, tempted by the prospect of avoiding the media circus. But then she thought of all the people who had experienced similar discrimination, without the power to make their voices heard, those who had been silenced, dismissed, or forced to swallow their dignity just to navigate daily life. "No," she decided, "I'll go through the main terminal." Her executive assistant, Jordan Taylor, was waiting at the gate, tablet in hand, and anxiety etched across his face. At 32, Jordan had worked with Zoe for 7 years, managing her complex schedule and serving as a buffer between her and the countless demands on her time and attention. "Zoe," he said urgently, using her first name as he did only in moments of crisis. "It's everywhere, every major network, all social platforms. The videos have millions of views already. How bad is the damage control situation?" she asked, walking briskly toward the terminal as security created a path through the reporters. "The board is in full panic mode," Jordan replied, keeping pace beside her. "Richard Coleman has called 6 times in the past hour. The PR team has drafted a standard corporate apology statement, but they're waiting for your approval before releasing it." Zoe snorted. "A standard corporate apology is exactly what we're not going to do." As they entered the main terminal, the scene became even more chaotic. Regular travelers stopped to stare and take photos. Airport employees whispered to each other, pointing discreetly. and more reporters seemed to materialize from every direction, shouting questions and jostling for position. Through the commotion, Zoe spotted a familiar face, Melissa Chen, the environmental lawyer who had spoken up during the flight. She was standing quietly to one side, watching the media frenzy with a thoughtful expression. On impulse, Zoe changed direction and walked toward her. "Ms. Chen," she said, extending her hand. "I believe we have more to discuss." Melissa looked surprised, but quickly recovered. "Absolutely. Ms. Franklin, walk with me," Zoe said, and continued toward the exit, now with both Jordan and Melissa flanking her. What are you doing?" Jordan whispered urgently. "We need to get you to the office for the emergency board call." "I'm recruiting," Zoe replied simply. Outside, her driver was waiting with the car, a discreet black Tesla Model S. Zoe turned to Melissa. "I could use someone with your perspective and courage in the meetings ahead. Would you be willing to consult on this situation? Your legal background and corporate accountability could be valuable." Melissa blinked in surprise, but didn't hesitate. "Yes, of course, I'd be honored." "Excellent. Jordan, add Ms. Chen to the team effective immediately. Standard consultant NDA and compensation package." Jordan, ever adaptable despite his confusion, nodded and made a note on his tablet. "Done. Now," Zoe said as they all slid into the waiting car, "let's talk about what happens next." As the Tesla pulled away from the curb, leaving the clamoring media behind, Zoe's phone rang with a call from Richard Coleman, CEO of Meridian Airlines. She answered on speaker. "Richard, I assume you've seen the videos." "Zoe, this is a complete disaster," Coleman replied, his usually composed voice strained with panic. "The stock is down 5% and falling. Social media is crucifying us. We need to issue a statement immediately." "We will," Zoe assured him, "but not the generic corporate apology your team has drafted. This requires something much more substantive." "What do you propose?" "I'll be at headquarters in 30 minutes. Have the entire executive leadership team and as many board members as possible in the main conference room. This won't be resolved with a press release and a settlement check." There was a brief silence on the other end. "Zoe, while I understand you're upset, and rightfully so, we need to be careful about overreacting." These were the actions of a few employees, not reflective of Meridian as a whole. It was exactly the response she had expected, the instinctive corporate reflex to isolate the problem, to frame it as an anomaly rather than a symptom of a deeper issue. "Richard," she said, her voice taking on the steely quality that had earned her the nickname the Quiet Hammer. "In business circles, what happened today wasn't an isolated incident. It was the predictable outcome of a culture that tolerates bias at every level, and as someone who now has the physical scars to prove it, I'm not interested in debating whether the problem exists." Another pause, longer this time. "Understood. I'll have everyone assembled when you arrive." After ending the call, Zoe turned to Melissa. "That's the first hurdle, getting them to acknowledge this isn't just about individual bad actors." Melissa nodded thoughtfully. "In my experience with corporate accountability cases, that's always the greatest resistance point. Organizations are structured to diffuse responsibility and shield leadership from the consequences of systemic problems." "Exactly," Zoe agreed. "But they've never faced a major shareholder who experienced their failures firsthand." Jordan, who had been monitoring news updates on his tablet, looked up with concern. "Bradley Thompson has already given an interview to Channel 9 News. He's claiming he was just following protocol and that you became belligerent." Zoe laughed without humor. "Of course he is. Predictable defense strategy. Paint the black woman as angry and aggressive to justify excessive force. The good news," Jordan continued, "is that at least 12 different passengers captured video of the incident from various angles. The footage clearly contradicts his version of events." "What about social media?" Zoe asked. "It's overwhelming. The hashtag Meridian discrimination has over 2 million posts already. Several civil rights organizations have issued statements calling for boycotts of the airline." And he hesitated. "And your personal background is being extensively researched and shared. Your journey from South Chicago to tech billionaire, your anonymous philanthropy, Your history of investing in struggling companies and transforming them. You've become something of an overnight symbol." Zoe sighed deeply. She had always valued her privacy, had gone to extraordinary lengths to keep her wealth and influence out of the public eye. That protective shield had now been shattered, likely irreparably. "We're also getting calls from major talk shows, news programs, and documentary filmmakers," Jordan added. "Everyone wants an exclusive. No interviews yet," Zoe decided. "First, we deal with Meridian. Then we consider the broader conversation." As their car navigated through Atlanta traffic toward Meridian's headquarters, Zoe's phone continued to buzz with notifications, messages of support from friends and colleagues who had seen the news, requests for comment from journalists, expressions of outrage and solidarity from strangers who had witnessed her humiliation via viral video. Among them was a text from her. "Mother, saw what happened. So proud of how you handled it. Now change that airline from the inside out. Love you." Zoe smiled despite her still throbbing lip. Elaine Franklin had raised her daughter to face adversity with dignity and to use whatever power she acquired to create meaningful change. Today would be a test of those lessons. The Tesla pulled up to Meridian Airline's gleaming glass headquarters in downtown Atlanta. The modern 20-story building, with its distinctive wing-shaped architecture, had once represented Zoe's vision for the company's potential. Now, as she stepped out of the car and saw the crowd of protesters already gathering near the entrance, it felt more like a fortress that needed dismantling and rebuilding. "Ready?" she asked Melissa and Jordan. They nodded, falling into step. Beside her as she approached the building, security personnel cleared a path, respectfully addressing her as Miss Franklin with a deference that stood in stark contrast to her treatment hours earlier. In the expansive lobby, Richard Coleman was waiting, his usual confident demeanor replaced by obvious anxiety. At 57, with silver hair and the tailored appearance of a lifetime corporate executive, Coleman had been a skilled steward of Meridian's recovery since Zoe's investment 3 years ago. But he had also maintained much of the company's traditional culture, a culture that, as today had demonstrated, was fundamentally flawed. "Zoe," he said, moving forward to greet her. His eyes widened slightly at the sight of the butterfly bandage on her lip. "I want to personally apologize for what happened. It's completely unacceptable, and I assure you those responsible will be held accountable." "Thank you, Richard. But individual accountability is just the beginning of what's needed here," Zoe replied. "I assume everyone is assembled." "Yes, in the main conference room. Most of the board has joined virtually on short notice." "Good. Let's not keep them waiting." As they rode the elevator to the executive floor, Zoe felt a curious calm settle over her. The initial shock and anger had given way to clear-eyed determination. This was no longer just about one horrible experience on one flight. It was about using that experience as a catalyst for transformation, not just at Meridian, but potentially across an industry with a long history of similar problems. The elevator doors opened to reveal the executive suite, where a group of anxious-looking staff members waited, their expressions as they saw Zoe with her casual clothes, injured lip, and unfamiliar companions revealed a mixture of shock, curiosity, and apprehension. "The board is ready for you, Miss Franklin," said Coleman's executive assistant, leading them toward the conference room. Zoe paused at the threshold, taking in the scene before her. Around the massive oval table sat Meridian's top executives, while on the large screen at the front of the room, the faces of board members appeared in a grid of video feeds. All eyes turned to her as she entered the mysterious major investor, whose identity had been known to only a few, now thrust into the spotlight under the most dramatic circumstances imaginable. "Ladies and gentlemen," Zoe said, her voice steady and clear as she prepared to address the leadership of a company she partly owned but had never openly guided until this moment. "We have a lot to discuss." The conference room fell silent as Zoe took her position at the head of the table, still dressed in the casual clothes she'd worn on the flight, the butterfly bandage on her lip a stark visual reminder of the day's events. Jordan and Melissa stood slightly behind her, tablets ready. Richard Coleman cleared his throat. "Perhaps introductions are in order for those who haven't met Miss Franklin in person." "In a moment," Zoe said, "First, I'd like everyone to watch something." She nodded. To Jordan, who connected his tablet to the room's display system. The screen came to life, showing a compilation of videos taken by passengers during the incident. The footage was raw and unfiltered. Bradley's contemptuous expression as he questioned her boarding pass, Diana's dismissive tone as she suggested. Zoe moved to economy, the physical force used to remove her from her seat. The moment her lips split open against the seat structure, and finally, the shocking revelation of her identity as a major shareholder. The room remained completely silent. As the video played, some executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others watched with expressions of genuine horror. On the video screens, board members leaned closer to their cameras, their faces registering various degrees of shock and dismay. When the compilation ended, Zoe allowed the silence to linger for several seconds before speaking. "That," she said, quietly, "is what happened on Meridian Airlines Flight 15-7 today. Not an interpretation or a second-hand account, but the reality captured by multiple witnesses." She paused, making eye contact with each person in the room. "I could begin this meeting by sharing my personal feelings about this experience. I could tell you about the humiliation of being physically dragged from my seat in front of dozens of witnesses. I could describe the pain of having my lip split open by your employees. I could express my outrage at being profiled, harassed, and assaulted while simply trying to fly home after a business trip." Another pause, her gaze unwavering. "But I'm not here for catharsis or sympathy. I'm here because what happened today reveals profound structural problems within this company, problems that require immediate and comprehensive action." Richard Coleman stepped forward. "Zoe, let me first say that everyone in this room is appalled by what we just witnessed. This kind of treatment is completely contrary to our values and policies. The employees involved have already been suspended pending termination, and we're prepared to offer whatever compensation you deem appropriate for this inexcusable incident." It was precisely the response she had expected: swift punishment of the individuals involved, followed by a financial settlement to make the problem go away. "I'm not interested in compensation, Richard," Zoe replied, "and while I certainly support appropriate consequences for the employees directly involved, focusing solely on their actions misses the larger point." She turned to address the full room again. "What happened today wasn't an aberration. It wasn't three rogue employees deciding on a whim to discriminate against a passenger. It was the predictable outcome of a corporate culture that enables and sometimes even rewards such behavior." William Hargrove, the 72-year-old chairman of the board, spoke up from his video feed. With his Brooks Brothers suit and club tie, he embodied the old guard of corporate America. "Ms. Franklin, while we all regret this unfortunate incident, I think we need to be careful about making sweeping generalizations based on one case. However disturbing, Meridian Airlines has a strong anti-discrimination policy and diversity initiatives that, with respect, Mr. Hargrove," Zoe interrupted. "Having policies on paper means nothing if they aren't reflected in actual practices. And as for your diversity initiatives, let's examine those, shall we?" She nodded to Jordan, who displayed a new set of slides on the screen, data that Zoe had been quietly collecting. For 3 years, these charts show the demographic breakdown of Meridian's workforce at every level, from ground staff to executives. As you can see, while people of color constitute nearly 40% of your entry-level positions, they represent less than 7% of management and executive roles. The data was damning, displayed in stark visual form that couldn't be easily dismissed. "But it's not just about internal demographics," Zoe continued. "For the past 3 years, I've been flying regularly on Meridian flights, documenting disparities in how passengers are treated based on race, gender, and perceived social status." More slides appeared, showing meticulously collected data points, statistics on which passengers were selected for additional verification, which were questioned about their seating assignments, which received proactive service versus having to request it repeatedly. This isn't anecdotal evidence. This is systematic documentation of patterns that reveal a disturbing culture of bias, both conscious and unconscious, throughout your operations. The room had grown increasingly tense. Some executives looked defensive, others embarrassed. A few seemed genuinely surprised by the data, suggesting they had been unaware of the extent of the problem. Patricia Reynolds, the company's chief human resources officer, raised her hand tentatively. "Ms. Franklin, I have to ask, why are we only seeing this data now? If you've been documenting these issues for 3 years, why wait until this incident to bring them to our attention?" It was a fair question, and one Zoe had anticipated, because I wanted to understand the depth and breadth of the problem before proposing solutions. She explained, and frankly, I wanted to see if Meridian's leadership would identify and address these issues on their own initiative. That hasn't happened. She turned back to William Hargrove. "You mentioned your anti-discrimination policy and diversity initiatives. When was the last time the board reviewed their effectiveness? When was the last time you requested data on disparate treatment of passengers? Have you ever conducted anonymous testing to see how employees respond to different types of customers?" Hargrove's silence was answer enough. "That's what I thought," Zoe continued. "These initiatives have been treated as box-checking exercises rather than meaningful commitments to change." Marcus Davidson, the company's chief financial officer, leaned forward with a concerned expression. "Ms. Franklin, while these are certainly important issues that deserve attention, I feel compelled to point out that Meridian's stock has already dropped 7% since the videos went viral. Our primary responsibility is to shareholders." "I am a shareholder," Zoe interrupted sharply, "the largest individual shareholder, in fact, and I'm telling you that addressing these systemic issues isn't just morally right. It's a business imperative. The financial damage from today's incident is just the beginning if Meridian doesn't commit to real change." She nodded to Jordan again, who displayed a new slide showing the financial impact of similar scandals. At other major companies, the stock drops, boycotts, lost contracts, and damaged reputations that had cost billions in market value. "This isn't just about avoiding a PR crisis," Zoe explained. "It's about building a sustainable business that treats all customers with dignity and respect, regardless of what they look like or how they dress. It's about creating an inclusive workplace where employees from all backgrounds can thrive and advance. And yes, it's about protecting your bottom line from the devastating impact of continued discriminatory practices." She paused, allowing her words to sink in. The room remained silent, the executives and board members now paying rapt attention. "I've prepared a comprehensive plan for transforming Meridian's culture and practices," Zoe continued. "It includes immediate actions, such as revised training protocols and accountability systems, as well as longer-term structural changes to address the root causes of what happened today." She handed out thick folders containing her proposal, a document she had been refining for months, anticipating a moment when she would need to push for significant change, though she had never imagined it would come under these circumstances. "I'd like the board to vote on implementing this plan in its entirety," she said firmly. "And I should make my position clear. As the holder of 40% of Meridian's shares, I am prepared to use every tool at my disposal to ensure these changes are adopted, including, if necessary, taking this to a shareholder vote or exploring other options for my investment." The implicit threat was clear. If the current leadership refused to embrace meaningful change, Zoe was prepared to force it through other means or potentially sell her shares, which would likely send the company's stock into free fall. William Hargrove frowned deeply. "Ms. Franklin, while we all agree that improvements can be made, this approach feels rather coercive. Perhaps we could establish a committee to review your proposals and implement them gradually over." "No," Zoe said simply. "No committees, no gradual implementation, no watered-down version of these reforms. What happened to me today has undoubtedly happened to countless other passengers who lack the power to fight back. Every day we delay meaningful change is another day that people are humiliated, harassed, or worse on our flights." She let her gaze sweep across the room again. "I understand this is uncomfortable. Meaningful change always is. But comfort isn't what's needed right now, courage is." Richard Coleman, who had been listening intently throughout the exchange, finally spoke up. "I've had a chance to quickly review some of Ms. Franklin's proposals, and while they are certainly Ambitious, I believe they represent the kind of bold action the situation demands. I recommend the board give them serious consideration." Zoe nodded appreciatively at Coleman's support, then turned to Melissa Chen, who had been quietly observing the proceedings. "This is Melissa Chen, an environmental attorney who specializes in corporate accountability. She was on today's flight and witnessed the incident firsthand. I've asked her to consult on the implementation of these reforms, particularly the creation of a passenger advocacy office that would provide an independent channel for reporting and addressing discrimination." Melissa stepped forward. "Based on my professional experience, the kind of systemic change Ms. Franklin is proposing is not only necessary, but advantageous from a risk management perspective. Companies that proactively address these issues ultimately fare better than those that resist until forced by litigation or regulation." For the next hour, the meeting continued with increasing intensity. Some board members pushed back, arguing that the proposed changes were too costly or disruptive. Others expressed concern about potential backlash from employees who might resent the implication that the entire company was biased. Throughout it all, Zoe remained resolute, countering each objection with data, examples, and the moral clarity that came from having personally experienced the consequences of the company's failings. Finally, exhausted but unbowed, she delivered her closing argument. "Today, I boarded a Meridian Airlines flight as an anonymous passenger, just like millions of others who trust this company to treat them with basic dignity and respect. What happened to me was a betrayal of that trust, not just by 3 individuals, but by a system that enabled their behavior." She touched the butterfly bandage on her lip, a gesture that silenced the room once more. "This injury will heal, but the damage to Meridian's reputation, and more importantly, to its soul, will only heal if we commit to genuine transformation. Not performative gestures or empty promises, but measurable, meaningful change that ensures no passenger ever experiences what I did today." She looked directly at William Hargrove. "The choice before this board is simple. Will Meridian be remembered as a company that doubled down on defending the status quo when confronted with its failings? Or will it become a leader in creating a more equitable and inclusive airline industry? Because make no mistake, what happened today isn't just Meridian's problem. It's an industry-wide issue that someone needs to have the courage to address." The chairman's expression remained inscrutable as he called for a vote on Zoe's proposal. One by one, the board members weighed in. Some immediately supported the plan. Others reluctantly agreed, clearly calculating the potential costs of opposing Meridian's largest individual shareholder under these circumstances. When the final vote was tallied, Zoe's proposal had passed not unanimously, but with a clear majority. The corporate showdown had ended in victory, but as Zoe well knew, the real work was just beginning. As the meeting adjourned, Richard Coleman approached her. "That was quite something," he said, a hint of admiration in his voice despite the circumstances. "What happens now?" Zoe's expression was determined, but not triumphant. This wasn't about winning a power struggle. It was about creating lasting change. "Now," she said, "we transform Meridian Airlines into the company it should have been all along." 6 months later, Zoe Franklin stood at the podium in Meridian Airlines' renovated training center, surveying the faces of the 200 new flight attendants graduating from the company's completely redesigned training program. The auditorium buzzed with nervous excitement as these men and women, representing a much more diverse cross-section of America than previous classes, prepared to begin their careers. "When I became executive chairwoman of Meridian Airlines," Zoe began, her voice carrying clearly through the state-of-the-art sound system, "I promised that what happened to me would never happen to another passenger on our flights. Today, as I look at all of you, the first class to complete our new comprehensive training program, I see that promise being fulfilled." The butterfly bandage on her lip had long since been removed, though a small scar remained, a permanent reminder of that fateful day 6 months ago when discrimination had literally drawn blood and sparked a revolution within the company. "Your training has been different from those who came before you," she continued. "Beyond the technical aspects of safety and service, you've participated in extensive programs on unconscious bias, cultural competency, and equitable treatment. You've learned not just how to serve passengers, but how to truly see them as individuals deserving of dignity and respect, regardless of appearance, background, or circumstances. The journey to this moment had been arduous and often painful. The comprehensive plan that Zoe had forced through the board meeting had transformed virtually every aspect of Meridian's operations. Bradley Thompson, Diana Ross, and Tyler Jenkins had been terminated immediately after the incident, but rather than simply scapegoating them and moving on, Meridian had used their actions as a case study in the new training program, an example of how bias could manifest in seemingly routine interactions. In a surprising development, Bradley had eventually reached out to Zoe personally, requesting a meeting. After much consideration, she had agreed. Their conversation had been difficult, but ultimately productive. Bradley had come face to face with the consequences of his actions and beliefs, beginning a process of genuine reflection and growth. While he would never work for Meridian again, he had recently begun speaking to other airlines about his experience, becoming an unexpected advocate for change within the industry. The company's executive leadership had also undergone significant changes. William Hargrove had resigned as board chairman 2 months after the incident, replaced by Zoe herself in the newly created role of executive chairwoman. Several other resistant board members had also departed, creating openings that were filled with more diverse voices committed to Meridian's transformation. Richard Coleman had remained as CEO, proving himself a valuable ally in implementing the sweeping changes. His corporate experience complemented Zoe's vision, helping to navigate the complex logistics of transforming a major airline from the inside out. Today marks not just your graduation, Zoe told the assembled trainees, but another milestone in Meridian's journey to become the industry leader in equitable service and inclusive employment practices. The changes we've made together aren't just the right thing to do morally. They're making us a stronger, more successful company. This wasn't mere rhetoric. In the 6 months since the incident, Meridian's financial performance had defied expectations. After the initial stock drop, the company's shares had not only recovered, but surpassed their previous value. As investors responded positively to the bold vision Zoe had articulated for the airline's future, customer satisfaction scores had risen dramatically, particularly among passengers of color who reported feeling more welcomed and respected. Employee retention had improved as well, with many staff members expressing pride in being part of an organization committed to meaningful change. None of this has been easy. Zoe acknowledged to the graduates, "Change never is. We've had to confront uncomfortable truths about our company culture and practices. We've had to unlearn ingrained habits and assumptions. We've had to hold ourselves and each other accountable in new ways." She thought back to the resistance she had encountered at every stage of the transformation process. Some employees had resigned rather than participate in the enhanced training programs. Others had complained anonymously to industry publications about political correctness overtaking the company. A few longtime customers had even declared they would take their business elsewhere, uncomfortable with Meridian's new emphasis on inclusion and equity. But for every person who resisted the changes, many more had embraced them enthusiastically. Melissa Chen, who had stood up for Zoe on that fateful flight, now led Meridian's new passenger advocacy office and independent department, with the authority to investigate complaints of discrimination and recommend policy changes. Captain David Reynolds, who had shown genuine concern for Zoe after the incident, had become a key ally in transforming the pilot culture, using his respected position to advocate for the new approach. Even Evelyn Parker, the elderly woman who had refused to sit next to Zoe, had unexpectedly become part of the story. After reflecting on her behavior, she had written a public letter acknowledging her prejudice and describing her own journey toward greater understanding. The letter had gone viral, prompting thousands of similar reflections from people examining their own biases. For the first time, as you begin your careers with Meridian, Zoe continued, addressing the graduates, you become ambassadors for a new way of doing business, one that recognizes the humanity in every person who steps onto our aircraft. The training you've received isn't just about avoiding incidents like the one that brought me to this podium. It's about creating positive experiences that affirm the dignity and value of each passenger. After the ceremony, as the new flight attendants celebrated with family and friends, Zoe found herself approached by a familiar face, Melissa Chen, now one of her most trusted colleagues. "6 months ago, I never would have imagined we'd be here," Melissa said, gesturing around the transformed training center, with its prominent displays highlighting Meridian's new values and commitments. "Neither did I," Zoe admitted, "but sometimes the most painful moments become catalysts for the greatest positive change." Her phone buzzed with a notification. Another airline inspired by Meridian's transformation and the positive press it had generated was reaching out to discuss implementing similar reforms. It was the third such inquiry this month, suggesting that the ripple effects were spreading throughout the industry. "The scholarship program launches next week," Melissa reminded her, referring to the Zoe Franklin Scholarship named after Zoe's mother, which would provide opportunities for underprivileged youth interested in aviation careers. "I haven't forgotten," Zoe replied with a smile. "My mother is flying in for the ceremony." As they walked through the training center, they passed a wall display featuring Meridian's new corporate values, prominently including dignity for all and courage to change. Beside these words was a stylized image of a butterfly, a subtle reference to the bandage that had covered Zoe's injured lip, now transformed into a symbol of metamorphosis and new beginnings. Outside, a Meridian Airlines Boeing 787 soared overhead, its livery featuring the company's redesigned logo, the same butterfly motif, integrated into the tail fin design, visible to all as a promise of the transformed experience within. The following week, Zoe boarded a Meridian flight from Atlanta to Chicago, this time dressed in her usual business attire. Unlike before the incident, she now traveled openly as the executive chairwoman, though she still regularly experienced the airline as a passenger to ensure the promised changes were being consistently implemented. The difference in the atmosphere was palpable from the moment she entered the terminal. The ground staff greeted every passenger with the same level of respect and attentiveness. Regardless of appearance or travel class, the boarding process proceeded smoothly, with no evidence of the profiling she had once documented so meticulously. As she settled into her first-class seat, Zoe reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. The physical and emotional pain of that day 6 months ago had been real and significant, but so too was the transformation it had sparked, not just within Meridian Airlines, but within the broader conversation about race, power, and accountability in corporate America. The flight attendant approaching her seat was a recent graduate of the new training program, a young black woman who moved with confidence and purpose through the cabin, providing the same excellent service to every passenger. "Welcome aboard, Ms. Franklin," she said with a genuine smile. "It's an honor to have you with us today." "Thank you," Zoe replied. "It's good to be here." And it was, despite everything that had happened to her, perhaps because of it, Zoe felt a profound sense of accomplishment. The airline that had once physically removed her from first class now embodied her vision for a more equitable and inclusive future. As the aircraft lifted off, climbing through the clouds toward Chicago, Zoe glanced at her reflection in the window. The small scar on her lip had faded considerably, but remained visible, a permanent reminder that sometimes one person's refusal to accept discrimination could transform an entire system. What would you do if you witnessed discrimination like what Zoe experienced? Would you have the courage to speak up like Melissa did? Comment below and share your thoughts on how we can all help create more inclusive environments. If this story resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share it with others who might be inspired by Zoe's journey from victim to changemaker. Thank you for watching, and remember, sometimes the most painful moments can become catalysts for the greatest positive transformations in our lives and communities. Zoe Franklin's story teaches us that racial discrimination often thrives in systems where accountability is lacking. When institutions prioritize profit over dignity, bias becomes embedded in their culture. True change requires more than punishing individual offenders. It demands transformation of entire systems. Power can be weaponized against prejudice when wielded with purpose. Zoe used her position not for vengeance, but to create lasting change that would protect others who lack her influence. Her approach demonstrates that effective leadership combines moral clarity with strategic action. The bystander effect allows discrimination to persist. While most passengers remained silent, Melissa's willingness to speak up made a crucial difference. One voice can inspire others to recognize their responsibility. Organizations resist acknowledging systemic problems, preferring to frame discrimination as isolated incidents. This denial perpetuates harm. Companies that embrace accountability ultimately become stronger, more innovative, and more profitable. Dignity shouldn't depend on status. Zoe was treated with respect only after revealing her position as owner. This highlights how marginalized people must often prove their worth. To receive basic decency, a fundamental injustice that requires our collective attention. Have you ever witnessed discrimination and felt unsure whether to speak up? What would you have done in Melissa's position? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe for more powerful stories about overcoming injustice. Share this video with someone who needs to understand how discrimination impacts real lives. Remember, change begins with awareness, but it only succeeds through action. Thank you for watching.